And that's all from the National Newsroom. It's now to Kerry O'Brien and the Premier of Lateline.
South Africa's blacks and the rest of the world celebrate the release of Nelson Mandela. But is South Africa prepared to make the crucial reform? Are the whites ready to start handing over real power, the power of the ballot box? Will they agree to one black, one vote? That's our story tonight.
Live from Sydney, the ABC's Lateline. Here's Kerry O'Brien.
Welcome to Lateline, a program that promises something new in Australian television. At this time, every Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday, we'll be looking at just one story, taking time to analyse a major event or issue that's in the news. Tonight, the dramatic events of the past few days in South Africa. We've all witnessed the euphoria of Nelson Mandela's release. But we've also witnessed some scenes of foreboding. Random police bullets fired into crowds to stop small-scale looting. Horrible beatings for celebrating churchgoers. Scenes which unfortunately suggest a negotiated settlement in South Africa is still a long way off. The fundamental question remains, are President de Klerk and the white community prepared to throw out apartheid and embrace a genuine democracy? In a moment, we'll cross to Johannesburg and pursue that question with a radical black activist, a white conservative politician and a prominent business leader who is seeking change. But first, to a man who has played a crucial role in bringing the South African story to the rest of the world. Michael Burke is a television reporter with Britain's BBC. For years, he battled government censorship to bring the truth about events in South Africa to television screens around the world. And the world was shocked. The South African government reacted with draconian bans to stop the world seeing what was happening. Rick Jay spoke to Michael Burke in London.
You know, there is a feeling of being swept along, of events really moving there, and a sense, I suppose, of optimism in the outside world about the future of South Africa that's great for the moment. But you really kind of worry how far it's going to go. You know, how far the whites are prepared to negotiate. You know, how broad Nelson Mandela's shoulders really are to carry the weight of expectations that are lying on him at the moment. You get a feeling, don't you, not just with South Africa, but Eastern Europe, the ground's moving right under your feet. And I think in South Africa there's that feeling too. I mean, on Sunday, you know, listening to the white South African broadcasters doing their live transmissions as Nelson Mandela went onto the balcony in Cape Town. And the one said to the other on air, he said, you know, of course, isn't it strange the way the communist flag is being pulled down all over Eastern Europe, and there it is, flying from the balcony of Cape Town City Hall.
We talk about one man, one vote and the state of emergency eventually being dropped. How far away are those things?
I think the really key question is what the whites are prepared to negotiate. I think a lot of things are negotiable. You know, all the sort of petty apartheid in which toilets you use, fine, that can all be swept away. They're prepared to share with the blacks some measure of power in some way, but you still hear talk about protecting group rights, no domination by the majority, even though, of course, for 300 years, South Africa has been dominated by the white minority. Group rights, this idea that the races have to be classified apart. And with it, the idea that the whites have to have some sort of specially reserved place within South Africa, shielded from majority rule, if you like. And that essential demand that Mandela made again of one man, one vote, on a common voter's roll, which is the key thing, which really means black majority rule. I just wonder, you know, whether there are many whites in South Africa prepared to contemplate it at this moment.
Margaret Thatcher here seems adamant that sanctions should be lifted to encourage further progress. People like President Bush and Nelson Mandela himself have said that sanctions should remain. What are your feelings?
Oh gosh, very mixed. Sanctions, I don't think, had an enormous effect on the South African government. They weren't the main reason that they sort of increased the pace of change there, I don't think. As a badge, as a symbol of South Africa's isolation, they were important. They did have economic problems for South Africa, shackling the economy.
The sanctions are very small indeed. They are gesture sanctions. When people are doing the right thing, boldly and courageously, as President de Klerk is, it seems quite absurd to still use sticks to beat them with, however small those sticks may be. It seems much more generous to have encouragement. The die is now cast. The way is open for peaceable negotiations. What is the use of trying to hit out? Why not help the process?
Perhaps, I think from Britain's point of view, what is a problem is that Mrs. Thatcher, by taking this very pragmatic view about things, and de Klerk needs encouraging, has kind of come out ahead of everybody else in such a way that I think most blacks in South Africa now identify Britain as a friend of apartheid.
Mr de Klerk is seen by many people as being a courageous politician. Is he in fact in control of, for instance, his own police and the far right wing?
Well, I mean, evidently not. He, as you know, gathered together the various police chiefs in the Transvaal and the other sort of key areas of South Africa and said, look, behave. We're going through a difficult time. You know, we don't want you to upset the political balance at this very difficult time. And what happens? The next thing you see in front of the television cameras is the policemen taking any opportunity to hit blacks on the street with clubs in front of everybody. And it makes the whole thing, not only makes the whole thing more tense, but makes the people abroad think that things are out of control.
Is the future there? Is there enough progress being made that there is genuine cause for hope for the complete change that the blacks want?
I think there's a period of great hope at the moment for South Africa, but the next few months are going to be so absolutely crucial to see how Mandela takes on this role which people have put around his shoulders, to see whether there can be the feeling that the negotiations will be leading somewhere that the blacks want to go. That's the big question that's got to be answered sometime in the next year. Not the final solution, but the feeling that they're on the way to some sort of final equable settlement in South Africa, and the blacks feel that. And if they don't feel that, then just loosening these various bonds of apartheid could set off a revolution rather than a settlement.
We're now crossing live to Johannesburg. And gentlemen, I'd like to introduce you a little more fully to our audience. Mos Chikane is a veteran leader of the Black Protest Movement. He's a member of the Mass Democratic Movement, a political arm of the ANC while it was banned. Clive Derby-Lewis is a member of the governing body of the Conservative Party, which holds nearly a quarter of the seats in the white South African Parliament. And Ronald Bethlehem is a senior executive with the powerful Johannesburg Consolidated Investment Company. Mr. Chikane, if I could start with you. You've spent a number of years in jail yourself. Why do you think Nelson Mandela was released?
I think Nelson Mandela was released because of the kind of pressure that my organization, together with the international community and even the white, right-thinking South Africans, have come to realize that, in fact, South Africa can only be built by people working together, talking to each other. And that is the reason why he has been released.
Do you believe that Mr. de Klerk is genuinely committed to reform?
I think there has been some positive intention on the part of Mr. de Klerk to move away from the old concept of apartheid. As at this stage, because it's still very early, one cannot say definitely that he will be able to pursue this program up to what stage, but definitely we think, as far as we have seen, he seemed to be quite committed to this program of reform.
Now, what do you believe are the major problems ahead for Mr. de Klerk in trying to implement genuine reform?
I think, one, it is the mistakes that have been created by the Nationalist Party for the last 40 years of, first, superior race, secondly, demarcation of people on the basis of color. Now, to work through those kind of things is going to take us a bit of time, you know. I think his problem, it is not that the majority of people are not ready to move with him, but he fears the backlash from the minority within his own ranks.
Now, how soon do you believe that the broad mass of blacks in South Africa want apartheid? How long are you prepared to wait for apartheid? How long are you prepared to wait for one vote for all? How long are you prepared to wait for land reforms?
We wanted this yesterday, but however, we are very realistic people. And we do not bear grudges against the younger generation within the fold of the Nationalist Party. We believe that a process, as long as he has unconditionally met the conditions set by our organizations, like releasing of all our leaders, lifting of the state of emergency, and when we say leaders, we mean all those who are in prison because of their opposition against apartheid. And all other conditions that have been set by the mass democratic movement, we think it will be ready to start on the process of negotiations, and especially now that the most respected leader in this country has been released.
Okay, if I could now turn to Mr. Clive Derby-Lewis. Mr. Derby-Lewis, your party was a breakaway from Mr. de Klerk's Nationalist Party, and you represent a quarter of white voters. Should Mandela have been released?
No, we say it was wrong to release Mandela, and Mr. de Klerk knows, as far as the white voter is concerned, that they agree with us, even to the extent of unbanning the ANC, and then, surprise of all surprises, the Communist Party. The Lord alone knows why that had to be unbanned, but nevertheless, that's caused a massive reaction, and Mr. de Klerk will feel the brunt of it whenever he has the courage to take the electorate back for an election, which we hope to force upon him quite soon.
Mr. de Klerk is, in the first instance, a politician and presumably not a fool. Why do you think he's done this?
Well, you know, if one studies Mr. de Klerk's political background, one will find that he's a politician full stop. He never made any waves in his life. What the public are saying in South Africa is that history is repeating itself. We now have another Jannie Smuts, who, as you know, was the United Party leader in the 40s. We have another Jannie Smuts at the helm, and the electorate in South Africa are going to deal with the new Jannie Smuts the same way.
You basically believe that apartheid should stay. You believe that the wealth and power, political power, should stay within the hands of whites. That's correct?
No, I don't believe that, and that is not the policy of the Conservative Party. The Conservative Party says there's only one way to eliminate the possibility of any form of domination in the political situation in South Africa, and that is to partition the country into political sovereign territories governed by each of the many nations which populate Southern Africa. That is the only way we believe that conflict can be avoided, and that is the only way that we can really arrive at a reasonable cooperation situation where after that all of the nations will then sit around a table in a sort of a confederal system similar to the European Economic Community, and will then discuss mutual problems regarding the subcontinent of Southern Africa.
But if that were to happen, wouldn't that only happen after a bloodbath?
I don't believe so. You know, on a recent program in the United States, Dr. Stoffel van der Merwe, the Minister of Education and Training, tried to criticize the Conservative Party's policy by saying, oh, you know, we compare our policy with the European option, and yet Europe had a bloodbath to partition the country, the subcontinent. But in fact, it was partition of Europe which brought an end to the bloodbath. And if we can, and we don't believe there's going to be much difficulty, convince the various African peoples that really what it's all about is a struggle for political power, and once that struggle has been resolved, we can get on with mutual activities which are going to be of benefit to all of us. I believe that we won't have much trouble convincing those peoples. We already have, after all, 10 self-governing African nations operating in South Africa presently. Four of them have opted for total sovereignty, which unfortunately the world will not recognize.
We'll come back to that point perhaps, but at this point I'd like to go to Ronald Bethlehem, who was a senior executive with the Johannesburg Consolidated Investment Company, the financial arm of the giant Anglo-American mining company and the BHP of South Africa, if you like. Mr. Bethlehem was one of a group of South African businessmen who decided to start their own negotiations with the African National Congress, even though it was banned. The businessmen and the ANC held formal meetings in Africa and eventually in Paris. It was the businessmen who took a crucial step in pushing reluctant white politicians towards the de Klerk reforms. Mr. Bethlehem, why was the business community the first to be seen to act in this way?
I think the business community is concerned with the economic performance of South Africa
in relation to what is happening here on the demographic side. South Africa is a country in the process of demographic transformation, and the economy has underperformed relative to population growth in a worrying fashion. If we want to inherit the future that South Africa is capable of, and I have a great confidence in the potential of South Africa, we have to solve the political problems. There's an inseparability of economics and politics in South Africa. And the gap between economics and politics has to be bridged. And we no longer, as economists or as business people, can stand aside and let decisions and debates occur in the political arena without inputs being made from the economic and business side.
So from your point of view, this is not a matter of human rights, this is a matter of survival, a matter of profits, a matter of keeping the economy on track.
No, I wouldn't say that. I think that would be a distortion of my view. I think that human rights are essential here. We're concerned with the rights of people to eat, with the rights of people to have jobs, with the rights for people to live and to be happy. And I think that economic performance is very much bound up with that. I don't want to defend in this program or on any other platform the vested interests of business. I think business has got to look at itself and to come to terms with the situation in South Africa. The central issue of the political economy of South Africa is the inequality of income and wealth that is manifest in this country, and that has to be addressed by government, by business, and by everybody.
Well, can I just clarify from you? Do you believe that apartheid should go? Do you believe there should be one vote, one value?
Apartheid is absolutely inconsistent with the kind of future that I believe South Africa can inherit.
Do you believe that, that every individual in South Africa should have an equal vote?
Absolutely so.
What kind of timetable do you believe that should happen in?
I think that's a matter of addressing in the hard realities of a power struggle. And if I may also just come back to that, every person having a vote, the central problem of the political debate is how to address the political structuring of the country. In the United States, every citizen has 7 votes, not 1 vote. A citizen votes for the president, he votes for a member in the House of Representatives, he votes for a member in the Senate, he votes for his mayor, he votes for his town council, he votes at state level as well. And when you see it in that kind of perspective, it really does reduce to a matter of structuring. And Mr. Mandela yesterday in a news conference here in Johannesburg acknowledged the concerns of the white community for some sort of structural treatment as far as the political dimensions were concerned.
If I could come back to Mr. Darby Lewis, I'd like to ask you, sir, whether you believe the kind of scenario, the kind of platform that de Klerk is running on now, at what stage in his attempts to implement these kinds of reforms do you believe bloodshed becomes a matter of course? In other words, that there is a white backlash?
Mr. O'Brien, when you talk about bloodshed, we already have bloodshed in this country. Far more serious bloodshed than we've had prior to 1976.
But while at this very moment you have the possibility of the ANC and the government each prepared to sit down and talk, don't you have the potential for at least a ceasefire, if you like, for a lessening of that violence?
I don't believe so. I heard Mr. Mandela commit himself directly to the armed struggle, and the armed struggle is violence. It's all very well for the business community to talk about the sudden concern with human rights, etc., etc. But you know, one doesn't have to think back very far in the history of this country to the exploitation of African labor by, in particular, the mining industry, where these people were brought in to work in the mines. They were subjected to the most disgusting of living conditions. They were paid far lower wages. In fact, we in the political arena had a criticism as far as they were concerned, that they used to pay the African laborers a lower wage than the South African Railways used to pay, and that was the bottom line, the worst possible scenario as far as wages were concerned. So for them to have sudden qualms of conscience now, when they're faced with a possible takeover, I think just illustrates that with business it's about big bucks and nothing else.
But even if they are guilty of the hypocrisy that you suggest they are, you have Mr. de Klerk and you have the major business corporations of your country judging that time is running out for you, time has passed your point of view by.
We had the business community and the government decide exactly the same thing pre-1948. And we went into a period of prosperity which was shared and enjoyed by everybody, which continued until uncertainty was created as far as the so-called power sharing experiment is concerned. And as far as sanctions and this sort of thing is concerned, I believe that the most important sanction which we experience at present is the lack of money, of capital, of working capital flowing into the country. But the working capital is not going to come into an environment which is as unstable as the South African environment is. Bankers are not interested in the political constitutions or dispensations in countries. Bankers are interested in securing their investment and making profits on their investment. And they're not going to make profits while we have the state of instability which we have, and so we can forget about capital investment.
Dr. Bethlehem, do you have a response to that?
Yes, I think that one can say that stability is something we all seek. It's a matter of how to achieve it. I don't see how you can achieve stability if you are going to exclude the great majority of the people from any constitutional participation in the country. That's the problem. And if I may just take up Clive Derby-Lewis's point on this question of the partition of South Africa, I think that economically that's not feasible. In fact, I would go so far as to say that the whole processes of history are in the opposite direction. We have an integrated economy. I think the great turning point in our recent political history occurred when the National Party recognized that the partitioning of South Africa economically was not possible. They continued to try to achieve some sort of political partitioning while accepting the economic integration of the country. But I think they've now got to the point where they recognize that there is an inseparability of both economics and politics. If one looks into the global trends, one can see that the whole world economy is in the process of restructuring. Even the Soviet Union, not prepared to cut itself off from the global economy, is being forced to restructure its economy and being forced to accept glasnost. And Southern Africa is going to have to achieve its relevance in a global context only if it can pull itself together. And South Africa is the central economy of the Southern African region, indeed the central economy of Africa in economic terms.
If I could move now back to Mr. Chikane. Mr. Chikane, Mr. Mandela sounded conciliatory in a sense on his release from prison, but you also had the sense that there was no wavering at all from the basic tenets of what the ANC has demanded over years. Now, is there any room for compromise from the ANC perspective?
Yeah, I think the process of negotiations is a process of give and take. And I believe that Mr. Mandela, and together with all the leadership of our people in this country, are reasonable men that have been able to prove themselves over years. There are people who do not bear grudges, and I believe that such people are people that you can talk to and be able to reach some kind of acceptable agreements. They are reasonable people, and they have proved it, even after spending so many years, over 20 years in jail. Mandela spent over 27 years of his life in jail. He's still not bitter.
What do you think are the biggest problems that you face right now? A white backlash? An incapacity to deliver a totally united black voice? What do you regard as the biggest stumbling blocks to a peaceful solution?
Well, I think the biggest stumbling block is, for instance, the so-called right-wing parties. There are definitely people who, I do not know, they don't seem to be belonging in this century. There are people who belong to the past. There are people who really, as far as I'm concerned, because majority of people in South Africa, I'm talking about at least both black and whites, both members of the Mass Democratic Movement, ANC, and even members of the white communities, including some members in the Nationalist Party, are prepared to work to a position of reconciliation. It's only a minority, which I do not think, in fact, it's a real threat if South African people can just forge ahead.
And I'm sorry, on that note, we're going to have to say goodnight to the three of you because we're about to lose the satellite, but thank you all very much for joining us from Johannesburg tonight. And now let's take a look at what's making headlines in tomorrow morning's newspapers. Sydney's Daily Telegraph reports that panic buying over the truckies' blockade is stripping shops. That's along with its inevitable Valentine's Day story. The Brisbane Courier Mail combines the truckies' dispute with the Queensland Government's plan for drivers who accrue 9 demerit points to lose their licences immediately. The Australian goes in a totally different direction, with an exclusive on ABC Managing Director David Hill, seeking an urgent meeting with Andrew Peacock to clarify the opposition's broadcasting policy. The Financial Review concentrates on AdStem's so-called core business plan and how the pilots' dispute has carved into TNT's profits. While the Melbourne Sun goes very local over racing stewards charging jockey Wayne Treloar with corruption and threats of violence. In Canberra, of course, election speculation still dominates and will do until the PM comes out of the closet. John Shovelin is in Parliament House preparing his report for tomorrow's AM program on ABC Radio. John, March 24 seems to be the new hot date. Is the Prime Minister going to make any statement this week?
Well, it's a possibility, Kerry. If he's not going to recall Parliament, he must do it in the next 2 days. If he's going to do it, it'll happen probably Thursday. If he's not going to recall Parliament, it'll happen Thursday afternoon or Friday, because that's when the Soviet Prime Minister's visit ends here in Australia.
He must have been reasonably happy with the Morgan Gallup poll that's due out tomorrow, showing Andrew Peacock's dip in popularity.
Indeed, Kerry. Mr Hawke's personal approval rating stands at 50%. Andrew Peacock stands at 18%. So to put it in the terms of one senior government minister about an issue quite some time ago, the government's riding the surfboard of optimism.
On the other hand, the banks today have signalled no fall in interest rates, housing interest rates, until after the election. I don't imagine they received that too well.
Indeed, that's the downside, Kerry. Despite the easing of deposit requirements, the banks are saying, despite whether the election's called in the next 6 or 7 weeks, that mortgage interest rates aren't going to be eased.
So we're going to have days and days more of election speculation before we know.
Well, we'll probably know. We'll have a better idea by Friday of this week.
OK, John, thanks very much. And that's it for our first Lateline. Tomorrow night, we bring Moscow and Washington together by satellite to measure the extent of the thaw in the Cold War. Hope you can join us again. Until then, good night.